Good morning, everybody, and I was very surprised but delighted to see the Union Jack there this morning. However, I don't think it's been put out just for me. But as a Brit, I'm immensely proud to present our keynote speaker this morning. It's the Right Honourable Baroness Neville-Jones DCMG, which is the Dame Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. The Baroness is a UK Special Government Representative to Business for Cybersecurity, appointed by the Prime Minister David Cameron in 2011. Prior to that, the Baroness was the Minister of State for Security and Counter Terrorism at the British Home Office, with a permanent position on the National Security Council. The Baroness is an active member in the UK Parliament in the House of Lords and has a long and varied career in many areas around the world, supporting Britain and also in the European Commission. Various roles include working at Her Majesty's Diplomatic Service, at the European Commission, the Head of Defence and Overseas Secretariat in the Cabinet Office, and Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet. The Baroness was also the Chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee and a Political Director in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. We're extremely privileged to have the Baroness serve on the UK Chapter Executive Advisory Board. And we're extremely grateful to the Baroness who flew in last night to present to us this morning and who'll be flying back to London later on today. Please give the Baroness a very huge Nashville, USA welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, I reckon you can about see me. Can you hear me? Good morning, everybody. A great pleasure to be here. Very first time in Nashville. I have actually spent more than 6 years of my life, one way or another, in the United States, first as a graduate student, and then subsequently in our embassy. And it always feels like home to come back. So I'm very pleased to be here. One of the things that Jeff didn't tell you in his very kind introduction was that I have also spent 10 years in the private sector, one way or another, after I left government, and between actually going to the political level. And I was chairman inter alia of one of our defense technology companies in the UK, QinetiQ. So I feel, while there are always things one doesn't know about a job you're going to do, I did feel reasonably qualified to take on the role when I stepped down from political office last year of the Prime Minister's representative to business on cyber security. Because I've been concentrating on one of the key elements of the British approach to how we advance cybersecurity, which is the partnership that's been developed in the UK between government and business, which, as I say, has been really, I think, a key element for us. Much of what I'm going to say is going to be obviously drawing on UK experience, and there'll be some some features of, I suppose, what I say which are particularly UK focused. But I do believe that the sort of issues that we've been tackling are ones that are really common to all those who are actually engaged in cybersecurity. And I've had quite a lot of dealings with American colleagues one way or another, and I believe that in many ways the approach is the same. Certainly the problems we're trying to tackle are shared. And so what I'm going to try and do is just tell you how we approached it in the UK, and then turn to some of the issues that I think we now confront. In some ways, I would regard them as being sort of second-generation issues. We've advanced a certain distance, and then we come up against another sort of line of hills. And I want to discuss some of the problems that we confront now, particularly the issue of standards, which I think is really quite difficult. But perhaps I could just start by saying a little bit about how I think cybersecurity has affected the whole notion of how we regard national security generally. And I think it's the case that, as compared with, say, 3 years ago when the present coalition government in the UK came into office, cybersecurity was regarded as something of an esoteric issue, which was of interest to a few specialists, closed to most normal people, and one where the experts talked to each other, but nobody else really needed to bother themselves. And it has gone from that in a very short time to being one which I think is accepted as being of central importance, while at the same time I think still being surrounded by far too much mystification. The very first thing we had to do, and I was very much the minister who was promoting this in the UK, I think was actually to get it recognised, the subject of insecurity, as being recognised as a real problem. And we succeeded in the national security strategy, which the government put out when coming into office, as getting it identified as a tier 1 risk for the UK, along with only 3 others, one of which was terrorism. And that was absolutely key then to getting some money. Can't do much if you haven't got any money. So we got an allocation, I might say in UK terms quite a substantial one, of $1 billion equivalent of US dollars over the lifetime of the Parliament. And that was at a time when all other aspects, I have to say, of security and defence, by and large, were actually being cut back, expenditure being cut back anyway. So I think that was an absolutely key move. The fact that alongside the recognition of the importance to national security was a recognition that actually comprised in that was a very important element of economic security. And economic security has now become, I think, identified in the UK as being an integral part of national security, was a very great help. Because the Treasury, the Finance Department, the people who normally say no, were much more interested in saying yes. Because they did recognize that actually one of the most vulnerable areas and one of the most valuable things that we had to continue to retain was the national intellectual property of the UK. And we, at the time, produced quite a number of figures designed to scare people about the losses that were being incurred. And we did a certain number of studies, and you inevitably find that the figures are disputed about whether these losses are real. But I think we did enough, actually, to convince people that actually the downside of doing nothing was very great indeed and was going to get greater. The other thing which I think started us off in the end was a lead taken from the top when David Cameron, Prime Minister, invited a number of top executives in the information security world, and also just leading businesses dependent upon information security, like bankers, into number 10. Not all of them Brits, there were at least 2 or 3 Americans around the table. Actually just put it on the table and say, look, we need a partnership here. The government can't do it all. We need you in business actually to help us and take a lead with us. And that's been, as I say, at the core of our approach, has been the partnership. And I think over the 3 years since then, there has been a real change, I think, in the way we then look at national security and also the way in which government actually works to achieve results. The massive economic component is recognised. It also means that the government has to modify the way it actually operates. The cross-cutting nature of cybersecurity issues, which cuts across, obviously, government services, national defence, private sector issues, and in fact, that matter, the national infrastructure, means that the sort of departmental silos, which I think most of us battle with, get government actually to work as one rather than as separate units, that really has had to be modified in this area. And the way we've done it is to get what I hope is a reasonably powerful central locomotion in the Cabinet Office, which has an overall directing role and which is able to monitor progress in the various areas. Is it perfect? No. Is it better than it might have been? Yes. Have we got somewhere to go? We certainly have. But I think it's symptomatic in many ways, I think, of the way government has to operate these days. And one of the things about government, which I'm sure you will have encountered, is that it's all very well, it's reasonably good at organizing its own assets. It's much, much less happy when what it's actually trying to do is to give a lead on the priorities for assets over which it doesn't have control. And that, of course, is where the partnership with the corporate world comes in. And so, as I say, I think that's, this is not going to be something temporary. This is an absolutely permanent feature, I think, of national security operations in the future. Well, that's the theory. What about the practice? Certainly, we've emerged from backroom to center stage. But I have to say, and this is where I start to have some reservations about how far we've got, we understand there has to be a holistic response. The design is yet, not fully in place for that. And this is a real problem, I think. The awareness, the general awareness, which certainly does exist these days of vulnerability to cyber attack, which is still being driven, I think, at the political level, really has yet, I think, to translate itself through to individual threat awareness. Now, having said that, there'll be a lot of people in this room who will say, no, goodness me, we're perfectly well aware in our company, in our business, this is the case. Well, in a sense, this is the hand-picked people who actually come to conferences of this kind, and indeed, this is our profession. But if you go out into the wider world of business, I think I'm sure you're aware that the level of both awareness and translate that through into actual action is still pretty variable and still has a long way to go. And that has a number of roots, I think, a number of causes. It's not so much, people don't want to do the right thing, but don't know how to do the right thing. And that we find that in those companies where there has been a higher level of awareness, say in banking, don't have so much of a problem. But in a lot of others, many of which have really valuable intellectual property, which is very important to them that they do not lose, and it's very important to the future of the economy that they are not lost. Nevertheless, they say, well, we don't find anything. We don't have a problem at all. And the truth of the matter is, they don't look in the right place. If you don't look in the right place, you sure won't find anything. And that is a real problem at the moment, which is, that the absence of any evidence is evidence of absence. It sure ain't. So that remains, I think, quite a problem. So obviously, we have to try and do something about that, and that's where the government has taken various initiatives, and it requires obviously CEOs also to be involved. I think that's the other thing where there's some progress has been made, but not yet enough, which is this isn't any longer just an issue for the techies. This is something actually for the boardroom. And the government has put out a certain amount of guidance, has impressed itself upon business that actually this is something that you need to be looking at the top. And the security service does actually visit companies. And that can have quite an electrifying effect, particularly if they go along with some evidence that they've got of a penetration. And there have been a number of instances where the penetration has been quite significant and the company has been totally unaware. and has wondered why certain things happened that they couldn't actually explain to themselves. Well, that tells you, this is an absolute concrete illustration of the problem. But I have to say that that approach, powerful as it is and important as it is not something that you can actually do at scale. It's not possible for government to do that at scale. It's not affordable for the taxpayer to fund it. We've got to find some other way. And so we have invented something which I'm not terribly happy about the acronym, which is CISP, which is it's a partnership between business and government on information sharing on cyber threat. It's web-based, and it's essentially concerned with sharing information between government and business in real time to raise general awareness of general situational awareness of the threat, and obviously also responses to it. So the government contributes its own knowledge, which is, GCHQ is a global, I think, an organization of global quality. So what goes in from government is worthwhile. But the point, of course, is over the long term, is to get business to the point where actually this can be largely self-supporting. Out of that, out of the exchange of information, obviously should come, first of all, greater awareness, but also a greater capacity to deal with it. And indeed, the information exchange does involve an analysis and fusion cell, so that the trends that are being witnessed are better understood, and appropriate action is more likely to be well honed. Basically sharing three types of information. Obviously the threat, and that obviously is information that can be used by companies and the network defenders really actually to deal with raising their level of protection. And then tradecraft, information on how to use the threat information to defend the organization over the long term in a better way. And then obviously the information about incidents which relates to the actual impact of a successful attack. And therefore what the effect that has on the business profile of the organization. It's perhaps worth saying that in the UK, the way we've set this up, I think we're lucky to some extent in not having some of the legal problems which I know have been encountered in this country in that kind of information exchange. We don't have a barrier in the sense for companies being able to talk to each other about information security matters. And that obviously very greatly facilitates getting something like this together. There are clearly, at the end of the day, some competition issues, and there are, I think one can't ignore the fact that this is a relationship and its purpose and its scope needs to be watched. But certainly as things stand at the moment, we don't believe in the UK that it's anti-competitive. This partnership, as I say, has got off to a pretty lively start in those parts of industry like defense and banking and telecoms where they're accustomed to talking to each other. It's harder work in those areas that I described earlier on where companies haven't done this before, still more skeptical possibly of the threat, and where getting together on this basis is a sort of cultural problem that some of them have to overcome. But I think that we are slowly making headway in getting a wider participation. And it's certainly the case that we do find now that in regulated industries, the regulators are making it quite clear that they do expect companies to participate. The Bank of England, for instance, is saying to the banking industry broadly, not just the clearers or indeed the investment bankers, but the allied industries also, in the finance world that they need actually to be part of this information sharing scheme. And in areas where there's important intellectual property, the government itself is concentrating on trying to get the message across. But there's a scaling up problem, is there not, even with this? How do you go from the sort of companies that you can get involved in this on a daily basis? And many companies don't have the resources, don't have the manpower, don't have any of those things which enable them actually directly to join a fusion cell of this kind. So scaling up is now really the issue that we're focusing on, having established some kind of core in the business world cooperating with government. How then do you actually spread it through the business community? Well, I'm going to give you an example from the defense community of the kind of approach that we're trying to adopt in that area to actually get scale and include small and medium-sized enterprises in it. Everybody will know that small and medium-sized companies are precisely the ones who have some of the most important intellectual property and are some of the most vulnerable. So scaling up, to get much wider coverage is a really important issue. And the way we've done it, certainly with the defense industry, and this I might say, ladies and gentlemen, is work in progress, is to form something called, which is industry-led, called the Defense Cyber Protection Partnership. And that has government participation, but it's essential. It's essential to its approach that actually basically business runs it. What the government did was to put it to the defense industry generally, because it had obviously, with government being the major client of the defense companies, it had bilateral dealings with all the majors and all the primes. But it put it to them that there really had to be some collective action at scale to raise cybersecurity levels across the industry. And what the government said, in effect, was, you primes really should share information with your suppliers about the threat and about the response. Well, it's a perfectly reasonable proposition. Putting it into practice hasn't been entirely plain sailing, and you can imagine some of the reasons. I mean, first of all, some primes are fairly reluctant to share information widely about an incident, and I think that's entirely understandable, because incident information is typically shared on a pretty strictly controlled basis, and even inside a company, and outside a company, really only with the directly affected customer organizations. Or if you're obliged to, obviously, with regulating bodies or national security agencies. So I think that is an inherent difficulty that you have to try and overcome. I think that commercial and other considerations, I think, that affect that sort of issue don't really exist when it comes to dealing more generally with the nature of the threat, or indeed the tradecraft that you need to bring to it. Even so, there remain also some classification problems. I mean, this is to some extent a particular problem of defense, though it's not peculiar to defense. And so you've also got to, how do you actually declassify sufficiently information to be able to push it down a system without it also at the same time becoming useless because it doesn't contain enough precise or enough detailed information. So that can affect both the utility and indeed, obviously, the timeless of the information. So, as I say, there are some practical issues there. Also, I think there have been real problems to get the SMEs also themselves organized to take part. Though I would say that unlike some of the big companies that we've dealt with, where awareness is much lower than it ought to be of the threat to them, actually mostly among the the SMEs. The SMEs are much more aware in our experience of vulnerability, perhaps for fairly obvious reasons. So they're quite keen, actually, to get involved. Cultural issues still remain, and I think one of the problems is that the primes do see themselves as constituting a fairly exclusive high-threat club, and they've really yet, I think, if I'm going to be frank about it, yet really convinced of their self-interest in cascading information of this kind to lower levels. And I really do hope, because I do think it's actually a short-sighted attitude, that we're not going to have to learn about the need to do this in a very hard way. There have been some notable instances, have there not, of loss of defense IP, and it's really, we do have to put some bounds around it. If we can get that moving, and obviously the question is, how do you replicate that, if indeed that turns out to be a successful recipe in other sectors? And I say, I don't think we have yet enough experience of what we're trying to do in the defense sector to know really whether that's going to be capable of being replicated in other areas. And clearly, they're not identical, and there will have to be variation in how you do it. But then you've still got the issue, when you've done that, is, well, okay, yes, now I'm much more aware, but what do I actually long-term do about it in my organization? And how do I know when I've actually done enough? What looks good when it comes to am I cyber secure? And as I say, I think this is where the next line of hills comes in, and this is the next generation of issues. I think that we are finding that the discussion of the standards issue is complex. It's taking time. What we want to try and do is get agreement on a basis that actually industry finds and business finds that it can use, at the same time that these standards should actually have real validity, real content, and shouldn't just be box-ticking exercises. And there is a danger, I think, with the whole standards issue, that it can either turn into something which is extraordinarily onerous and indeed actually interferes with the good running of government, and at the other end of the spectrum can actually be really a formal exercise without any real content. So how do we go about that? Well, obviously the standards field's not virgin, and certainly in Britain we've issued guidance on how you should go about increasing the maturity of your organization in the area of cybersecurity, and there's something called the 10 steps, which one of the departments of government has issued, and there's another top 20 controls, which GCHQ has put out as being, with the security service, as being advisable. They're very similar, those top 20 controls, to what SANS has done in this country. And there are obviously international standards like ISO 27000. There are other organized and recognized standards for smaller companies. And they're virtuous, and they're principle-based, and they're principle and organizationally based. But I think they still leave us with two problems. Obviously, there's no single standard here. This isn't going to be a field in which we can have a single standard, and that adds to complexity. And the other problem is, as I say, is that when it comes to cyber, it isn't self-evident. It is not self-evident how you actually implement the standard, or how you validate them. And the conclusion we came to was that actually where we had to focus attention in trying to get something that was workable and not too onerous was actually in the question of what the validation process was. And so there's a great exercise going on at the moment in taking each of the controls and actually trying to put beside that a process which will enable a company actually to validate its own position and know whether actually what it's doing and what it's got is at the level that it needs. And you don't need to do, all companies don't need to do the same thing. I mean, this is one of the problems, is that there's no need to require a company that has relatively little cyber threat to it, which doesn't have a particular profile in that area. It does not need to have anything like the same level of control and validation as some company which is obviously right at the top end of the spectrum. So getting the right level of rigor and the right level of maturity for different companies in different sectors, I mean, is itself one of the challenges. And again, the government's working, you know, with the defence industry on, and what they've done here is to work with the Defence Industry Federation, or ADS, to actually to work on the whole question of how we formulate some workable controls. And what first thing they've done is to create a sort of measurement and standards framework, which recognizes that there can be variation. And that variation, as I say, depends on obviously what field you're in, but also, you know, what your nature of your company chain is. And there can be misapprehensions about the importance of and the criticality of companies in the supply chain. Let me give you an example. Obviously, you know, right at the basic level, there are protections which all organizations need, which are antivirus and anti-malware and so on. But then you need, say, an assessment of how they're actually applied. And that's where it starts to get complex, because how well they're applied, you know, will to some extent depend on how critical, as I say, they are. And what determines criticality? Well, obviously, level of classification that a company holds and the sensitivity of the aggregate data across the projects that it's working on. I mean, those are all relevant considerations to criticality. Level of intercompany connectivity is another. Now, how close is my relationship? I mean, how seamless is daily life? No, does the supplier have a direct IT connection with me? And then I think there's a third issue, which is less evident, but I think really key, which is that, take an example, a company in a supply chain which produces an algorithm that is fundamental to security or the products that it's getting on can constitute, you know, a major point of compromise in the chain as a whole, even if the element of, you know, direct connectivity is not actually there. And the point is obvious, you know, because if that algorithm is key to the cybersecurity of the chain as a whole, and if that goes down, obviously, you know, a lot goes down. So what I would say is that size and intercompany connectivity are not the only guides that you need to have to, you know, to where your critical points are. And I say it can quite often be actually quite a small company in the chain, which is actually crucial to a much wider level of security in the chain as a whole. And so identifying the critical dependencies is a very important part of the exercise. And I think some big companies are quite surprised and also quite dismayed to discover that quite a lot of their critical dependencies actually lie outside their direct control. And I come back, therefore, to the wisdom of being very interested in your supply chain and taking real responsibility for it, because it is, in the end, your security. All this has, you know, been getting to grips with all this has been quite a challenge. And the thing that strikes one, of course, is that the scale of this task is huge. At the same time, you can't just skim along. You do actually have to get down into the nitty-gritty, and I don't see there's any two ways around this. And doing this validation exercise and then putting it into effect in a company, it does take time and it does take resource. And it does mean, of course, it costs. And it particularly costs the smaller companies, because, I mean, though I think we're saying to the primes, this is something that you should be interested in, clearly, some of the costs are going to descend down the line. The government has put forward a scheme for a small amount of money on a rather temporary basis is going to be available to some of the smaller companies to improve their security. I have to say I hope that actually this scheme is going to be extended, because I think it's an important part of actually getting things moving. Perhaps in due course we can find some ways of automating some of this work, because I think we've got to find some way of making it both less painful, less time, resource intensive and time consuming, but at the same time effective. So market opportunity, I hope, for someone. This is all, I think, and I'd be interested in perhaps if we have time to discuss it, what the US experience has been in this area. I certainly think that in the UK we're finding it quite demanding, but do regard it as being pretty important. And it does break new grounds. And when you talk to, I think that the defense industry, which has been used to talking to competitors about the threat, one of the things we are finding is that not all of them are, as I say, wild about talking about to each other about their supply chains. I'm not myself convinced that this is really a serious problem, because these supply chains, there's an awful lot of overlap, between them. And at the end of the day, most of them actually have government or government organizations as their prime customer, and the government's going to want to know. I mean, I have the power of procurement, which is an important power for government to exercise, and government will, I think, in due course say, okay, and want to know about your supply chain too. So I think actually this reluctance is probably in the end a bit pointless, because I think it's going to come out in the wash in any event, because it's actually going to be something which companies in bidding for contracts are actually going to have to be able to tell the future purchaser, what the level of security is that they've actually managed to attain. So I think the high threat club needs to understand, I think, in the end, that doing this work is a business enabler. It is a cost, undoubtedly, but in the end it's a business enabler, and insecurity is real risk. So what we hope is, I say, this will be a proving ground of some kind for other business. But I think that it will need, as I say, adaptation. It is fair, is it not, that in the defense industry there is experience of quite a lot of top-down working. I mean, the primes have been traditionally integrators, and so there is a notion of how the industry can operate and the relationship between big and small. That doesn't apply in an awful lot of sectors of the economy. So I think that we will have other issues to face if we try and broaden this across other sectors as well. Well, I just wanted to, before finishing, just say one other thing, which I think is the sort of the what next issue, or at least one of the ones that worry us when we stop to think about where is all this going. I mean, controls, in order to be valid, do need to be in the right place and obviously be effective. And it remains a feature of the cyber world, and I reckon it's going to for the foreseeable future. The advantage lies with attack. I mean, the history of weaponry, if you go back through the centuries, there have been periods when the advantage has lain with attack and periods when it's lain with defense. Very, very clear at the moment, as far as we're concerned, and as far as I can see for the foreseeable future, in this world, it lies with attack. Perhaps that'll change, but not, I think, in the sort of time scale that we need to deal with. So you then have to look, I suppose, at what the likely consequences of that are. And clearly, it is the case that enforceable international agreements are going to be very difficult to negotiate, and the barriers to entry into capacity to penetrate and attack are very low. So this is a very skewed playing field. And I've no doubt that fraud and denial of service and all the rest of it is going to go on. But I think that the type of attack I think that's more worrying now is particularly as attack becomes more sophisticated and targeted, is really the ones that are focused on taking control of networks, sitting on networks, waiting for a moment, not for reasons that go beyond just disruption or data theft or manipulation. And they may or may not choose to activate the possibility of control, but I think the thing we need to worry about is the capacity of the attack actually to do just this. Well, obviously, one of the more plausible scenarios in time of conflict or in the run-up to conflict, and I'm now talking about state to state, is obviously the so-called asymmetric attack on civilian systems. And I know this is something that the US has made its position clear about what it would regard as a potential act of war. And I think the US is quite right to do that. Because clearly, these attacks designed to disrupt essential services and distract government from focusing its effort on the overt situation, that is a deliberate intent on the part of the attacker, and it can have profoundly damaging consequences. And I would say that you look around the world, that this kind of attack on civilian systems is increasingly being used, not just in the run-up to particular spikes in tense relations between states, but actually just as a form of harassment. It's becoming, I think, built into the system that this is something that is going to go on, and there are parts of the world where you can see that being the case, more than others. Nevertheless, as we all know, no distance is no protection. The fact that you may be, as indeed most Europeans are, quite a distance from any area of real tension, we also know, quite obviously, that is not something that gives you any kind of shield when it comes to being a target. So the globality of it is something that no government, no country can afford to ignore. And I worry, I must say, about what I think still remains the huge gap in protection in relation to critical infrastructure and SCADA systems. I think that it's an obvious point, is it not, that resilience of essential services is a fundamental national security issue. And I think there, rather as in business, the task that we have in front of us is pretty huge. And we need to establish a much better understanding than we have now of crucial network interdependencies, do the sort of mapping of them, which I don't think we've ever really considered to be necessary until now, but we need to do it now in order to identify priorities for protection. And that information base has to be available to the organization responsible for issuing cyber alerts and indeed managing crises that might follow a successful penetration. But at the same time, getting the existing civil contingency and first responder systems, which I think all of us have these days, and which are already responsible for managing the physical effects of emergencies, they've got to be linked in. And certainly, as things stand at the moment, we're developing in the UK a method of responding to, trying obviously to prevent, but I mean responding to emergencies in the cyber world, have we yet got that linked properly to what for us is ultimately a police-run system of physical responder systems, for the effects of emergencies, not yet properly. Much more work to be done, designing how that will work on the night, and you don't have to work it out when you actually have a disaster ahead of you. That's where exercising things is extraordinarily helpful and useful, and one of the lessons that the UK learnt in the preparation for the Olympics. The Olympics did quite a lot, in fact, to upgrade quite a lot of systems, which ultimately, are to do with information security. But it also included forcing members of the government actually to test their mettle in emergency scenarios which had been invented by clever civil servants and designed actually to pose them with really, really difficult situations. And we did some of them, and they're really hard. But the interesting thing is that when you're in your third exercise, first of all, you know much better what you're trying to do, and secondly, you're much less worried about putting a foot wrong. So I do actually think that exercising the system at all levels, but right at the top as well, is a very important part of actually dealing effectively with an emergency when it actually happens. So I think both our governments, both the UK and the US, have infrastructure resilience on the agenda, but I would maintain that we don't, either of us yet really have a satisfactory analytical or knowledge base that we need to really to operate off. In the UK, I think also that we're not yet in a position of having really clearly assigned responsibilities for upgrading and managing systems, and certainly system security, and the crisis management over them. And obviously the national CERT organisations should be important players in that field, but I think we have yet to really identify for them what their role and powers should be. So I would say that this is, in a sense, the sort of next piece of work that we need to focus on. And the problem with cybersecurity is you've got to do all these things at the same time, including actually dealing, which I'm not going to talk about, but which is very, very important, is upgrading the skills base in the country. We don't have nearly enough people, and we haven't laid the education base for it. So that has to change as well. I would say that there really is at the moment a gap in the market for offering technical solutions for strengthening control systems between antivirus products at one end and the high-level cryptography, which with Five Eyes and people use, which are really relevant to security in SCADA systems. I think we probably there is real market opportunity, because I think we've got a lot of really clever stuff, and we've got a lot of in a sense plain vanilla the other end, and there's a middle area where probably there's still need for development of technical solutions. Obviously the cloud should simplify some of this, but of course it raises the bar on the level of security overall. So just to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, what might one say are the key elements for successful cyber security policy? I would say when it comes to government, that government must give a lead, but it can't do it on its own. There has to be, as I say, a partnership. But even when that partnership is well underway, and the UK intention is that really industry should be in a position to look after itself, I think a continuing lead from government will continue to be necessary. It's fair enough, I think, for government, even when it's not itself in control of all the assets, to apportion responsibility for who actually does then take on the load, and making a reality of the partnership, I think, is one of the tasks, and I think it's partly conceptual, not just organizational between the two, because I think that both private and public do have to accept sort of new boundaries on what they can and must do, with actually the private sector stepping up to the plate in a way on national security issues that I think they've not been accustomed to doing in the past, and the government at the same time understanding that actually if it wants to both require business to do this, it must also help it enable it to do it. So there is I think, a challenge there of how the two sides actually relate. But I do believe, at the end of the day, the corporate social responsibility, this great phrase, is actually taking on new dimensions. Last point, I think that we do have to accept, given what I've described to you, I think we do have to accept there is an element of slog in all of this at the moment, because you've got to get the systems established and bedded down, and then it ought to become easier. But that is quite a long-term task. What we should do, of course, is to make this a legacy task. What we shouldn't do is have to go on repeating this. So security by design, that great phrase, that's something that really does need to be given real meaning. So I would say, we've started on reasonably well on a long journey. Not possibly as far along the road as we should be. General awareness of the risk being slowly translated into understanding of the need to take action on an individual basis, and government and business coming to a degree of understanding about their respective roles. So I think that we're doing reasonably well, ladies and gentlemen, and I think the UK experience shows that actually it's after the early stuff, the second stage of implementation is actually does require sort of real determination, and we mustn't allow ourselves, I think, because it's quite hard, to be put off or give up, because this is the bit that actually will make the real difference. So, getting security at scale is, I think, what we need to do now, and get the coverage across the economy. And I haven't dealt with the national security sector personally, because I think there's a degree of awareness there, which and government, I would say, UK government doing reasonably well. I could go into some detail about things which I don't think are quite right, but nevertheless, I think that for us, it is getting this relationship between these two great partners in a state where what we depend on, for security on a daily basis, under this much broader definition of national security, really works. Thank you very much.